in the newsroom?
I find this whole debate fascinating, and I think it isn't just journalists, but I think across the board, I'm sure you, like me, have been having conversations with all your friends. You know, have you experienced this? How have you experienced it? All throughout different professions, different walks of life. And it made me think about things that happened to me that I probably hadn't thought about for years. And I do think, certainly when I started working in television news and broadcast, there was a sense, if you were a young woman, that you were slightly fair game. And it wasn't necessarily always at your desk, but there was a lot of socialising around work, which was a necessary part of getting on in your career, whether it was at the pub or at parties or on the road. And you had to have sharp elbows. And there seemed to be a lot of, mostly men, but I would say there's women in there as well, who, in a position of authority, who didn't think twice about either launching on you or making suggestions or just assuming that you would be up for it. And I have to say, I feel lucky. I had a few scrapes, but I always managed to get myself out of them. And I progressed in my career and I was fine, and it didn't affect what I was doing. But I can't say the same goes for anybody else that was my contemporary and started. We did a body of work when I was at Channel 5 News last year, where we just were hearing more and more tales from the younger women at work about everyday harassment that they and their friends were experiencing, not in the workplace, but through all walks of life. So we started a campaign around it, and it coincided, it was just before the launch of all the reports about Weinstein and Me Too, so it felt very, very timely. But I was sort of shocked to hear about it. And I have to say, I am not complacent in any way, but certainly the women working in my office were not talking about it happening in the workplace. It was very much elsewhere. So I hope in certain parts of the media that we have come a long way from when I started, and there was this sort of fair game culture. But I have to say, what worries me, and I'm sure we'll come into this, is our work is not just in the office. A lot of it is out and about, and was I can hand on heart say I think nothing was happening in my newsroom. I can't do that for the pubs, for the after work parties, and that is very difficult as a manager, because you want to protect your staff, and it shouldn't be that they have to get on through doing this extra stuff, but the reality is you do get on by socialising, and I don't think we can safely say that our staff aren't being harassed in those situations.
Thank you, Rachel. I just want to bring Jasmine in, because you're one of the founders of Second Source, and for me, I know quite a lot of people here know about Second Source, but obviously in the context of what Rachel's been saying about how things have changed, there was a kind of sea change last year that changed some of the conversations. Can you just talk to us a little bit about what Second Source is and how it became part of that conversation?
Sure. So Second Source came to light on the back of the Me Too allegations. There was a couple of us female journalists having a conversation about things that had happened to us. You know, these were one-on-one conversations. And then Emily Reynolds, a journalist you'll probably know, decided to create a piece that spoke about a particular harassment incident she'd experienced in her workplace. And that's when Ros Irwin decided to get in touch with Emily and say, hey, do you want to do something about this? And she said yes. So Ros brought on Stephanie Boland, Emily brought me on, and then we started to think about other women in the industry, other friends, other colleagues that have potentially experienced this or were really driven and passionate about doing something about it. Because I think now, when you enter the industry, it's a lot more about patronage, and it's a little bit more sophisticated, it's a little bit more insidious. So hopefully together we can present a really active force and say that this isn't going to happen anymore. We're really determined to change that conversation.
Thank you. Louise, you're part of that conversation. Can you just tell me a little bit more about what you go about doing in terms of trying to say this isn't happening anymore, we're going to be part of this, we're going to be part of the change? What exactly is Second Source doing to combat that?
Yeah, so we've got a kind of a number of different things we've been trying to do. The first one is just kind of trying to be an informal network, in that, you know, we know there is networking, but something I found personally, I think we've all found, is that lots of us are younger women, and bizarrely, even though I have lots of friends in journalism from previous jobs, I haven't connected lots with women in different parts of the industry, and I think that's really, really important. And with anything like sexual harassment, we know it's difficult to talk about. You want to speak to people in the same position as you, but maybe not in your workplace, and it's that solidarity that we think is really, really important. So we've been holding events, we had a great event in December, and we'll be holding more hopefully. What we're trying to do, which is an ongoing thing, is to collect sexual harassment policies, the HR policies of all the different media organisations. That is an ongoing mission, and it's proving quite slow and difficult at present, but we are persevering, and the idea of that is to look at the gaps, look what's there at the moment, and see if we can come up with some best practice to make sure that companies have the right stuff in place. We're also doing something that we can announce, I think, which is tonight/tomorrow for International Women's Day, we're launching a mentoring scheme. Obviously, there are lots of great schemes out there, but for us, this scheme is particularly aimed at women in the first 5 years of their career, women who perhaps are a bit lost or think they might drop out of journalism. Particularly, we want to focus on working class women, ethnic minority women. We want to offer all the normal career advice and support, but what is really important for us that we found from each other is to offer support for those personal and difficult issues if people want to talk about them. So difficult bosses, harassment, office politics, feeling uncomfortable, how to fit in, and all those things that I've had lots of great mentors, and sometimes I've been paired with them in mentoring schemes, which is wonderful. Sometimes though they're so senior, or I haven't met them before, that it's quite difficult to really talk about those things that are really problematic for you in your workplace. So we want to be really open that that's what we want to try and offer. So we'll be putting that up on our website
You're open
tomorrow.
to both people wanting to mentor and to people wanting to be mentored?
Yeah, initially we're thinking of mainly the people in our group mentoring, but if no one wants to be a mentor, that'd be great to hear about as well, yeah.
We had a conversation before about how important second source was in terms of being able to identify with people like you. And I think you were talking about coming from working class community, how important it was for you to be able to speak with women like you. Can you talk to me a bit more about how identification is so important in this instance?
Yeah, it's incredibly important because I don't think I'm saying anything controversial in the fact that we know that this industry is a straight, white, male-dominated industry. And a lot of us have got to that point in the conversation where we're aware that we need to do a lot more to diversify our workforce, but we don't quite know what to do about it. And I came from local newspapers, still had a relatively traditional trajectory, even though I am working class. I did get my degree, do my NCTJs, and then kind of work from there. But I've even noticed in the first year that I've just had as a freelancer before I took this role, how few role models there were for me. And I did particularly bond with the very few people that there were out of working class communities, because they were what I had, just to have that reference point when you are going through a very grueling role, a very time intensive role, and a role where you really have to be sure of your own instincts and really be self-determined. It's absolutely essential that you have people like that around. And you know, that goes for LGBT people, that goes for people of a different ethnic minority, that goes for women with a disability. You know, we're fully aware that, and I'm definitely fully aware that those unique challenges need to come with people that represent and support you.
Thank you, Jasmine. I'm acutely aware of the colleague to my right here, who obviously represents someone slightly different.
It's very humbling because often it's the reverse, and you guys are the ones on the other side. So it's really great.
We're far from Matt.
I was at a Guardian panel this morning where there was 4 blokes on a political panel and no women.
So it was a manel, yeah. Which none of us like these
It was
manels doing.
disgraceful. I was just like, surely one of these blokes should just walk off, and Jane Martinson from the Guardian.
Get some token burden, yeah?
Yeah.
So from your perspective, Mark, you've done a lot of work writing about the issues around harassment in the newsroom, around issues to do with the role you play as a man, kind of writing about this. I really kind of want to hear about your perspective on that, if that's okay.
Yeah, look, it's at times like tonight, I don't want to come across as the man on the panel, because I would just love to impart as many anecdotes as possible from my perspective, and I also would just love to join in on the conversation. But I will say, as I said before, it's kind of humbling to sit here with 4 incredible women, because I feel as though, I arrived in this country 6 months ago, and I feel that there's been a sea change that happened the end of last year. very noticeable in the wake of the Harvey Weinstein allegations. And every young man in the industry should sort of pause and just take stock a little bit and kind of reflect on their own behaviours. I know that I have. I know that my friends have, my male friends have. I know that it's not only the high level employment stuff, so it's not only like, you know, how we deal with our female employees, it's also like how we deal with our female friends. It's how we deal in group chats. It's how we deal in WhatsApp threads. It's how we do, and you know, it's little things like if you find yourself in a room and it's like 6 men and one woman, those kind of those gender imbalances you really start noticing. I was in a WhatsApp thread the other day with 4 blokes and 1 woman, and the 4 blokes, the 1 woman was doing a speech, and the 4 blokes just started giving advice to what the woman should do, and it was just one of these things after about 5 minutes that I said to the female friend of mine, I was like, you should just ignore everything you just got told because it's probably awful advice. But going back to what you were just talking about before, I mean, I had done a little reporting about this issue. We were talking about this before we came up here. The hardest thing when it comes to reporting about harassment and allegations in this environment, which I mean Britain, is that libel laws are very strong, and reporting on anonymous sources is very hard. And you know, funnily enough, the group is called Second Source. You can have, I literally had a dozen anonymous sources on a story that all corroborated each other at the end of last year that would have taken down a very senior media person here in Britain, but I could not get past my editors because I needed someone on the record. And when I'm trying to get someone onto the record, as a 29-year-old straight white man, and I'm trying to tell this 24-year-old who has worked in a newsroom for 12 months, can you just please come on the record, put your name to it, trust me on this, blah, blah, blah. I realise that the interaction that I'm having is fucking challenging. You know, it's not normal. Like, it's not this, I actually think sometimes if a woman in my office was doing the interviewing, it probably would have been more comfortable for that person.
Just in terms of what you've heard from Mark, what would be your response there to his experiences?
It's in reporting wise, and I think a lot of it is led on preference of your interviewee, really. So if you are able to facilitate an option for a person, I think that is really important, but obviously in the time sensitivity of a newsroom that doesn't necessarily always happen. And as well, I think there's a way and a tone that you can take that is respectful and does adhere to that person's needs. And as well, I know what you're referring to in terms of that wider culture. I've even known that when I first started out as a journalist, where everyone used to talk about one particular company back up north that used to have drinking nights and end up in a strip club every Friday. And that was just a given. That was just like a common occurrence. And if you weren't involved, well, tough shit, basically. And I think that although younger male journalists may be starting to have those conversations and they're fruitful, they're useful, I actually think the problem is still very much there with the older male journalists, the news editors that have been, you know, not general editors that have been in this position for so long. They've had a decade of that behaviour and they've seen so many news stories come and go, but this is fixing. This is really a cultural shift and I am so excited about it. We were all so excited about it, and this is when they need to start to take notice and think, okay, nights that end up in a strip club are not particularly accessible for everyone, and furthermore, not are they only just not accessible for women perhaps, it's other people, you know, from other ethnic minorities. I don't think particularly a devout Muslim person is going to feel that comfortable in a really heavy drinking environment, and that's the social activity they get with their colleagues. I'm hoping that, you know, as well as men addressing these conversations, we're all having these conversations about equality and what that means and what it looks like.
I think a lot of this can be this kind of culture in terms of so I came into journalism 11 years ago, and I was doing loads of work experience in newspapers, and all the older male editors were saying to me, oh, we used to go to the pub for ages, and oh, we used to have the long lunches, and I didn't really see that as much. That was dying out, definitely. So, but you still have those people, as Jasmine just said, working higher up, so that the feeling of the culture is still there, even if perhaps the regular drinking propositioning is not as public. It happens individually, and as we know and has kind of been touched on, a lot of harassment is happening outside of the office. I think inside the office is really important and you can do more about it. But outside, when you're just going for a drink with one person, or you're freelance, or you're an intern, and you're just going for a drink with someone to try and get a job, who is going to protect you? And if that culture is still in their mindset that they can take advantage of you, what are you going to do? It's difficult.
Thank you for that. I've just had a couple of awful flashbacks to my past, which I started off as a journalist in 1999, and I had one instant where I was going for a job, and part of the job interview process was drinking in a pub with a white man, and us basically trying to drink each other under the table, and it was assumed that that would be how I would go and get my job. And I mean, you know, a lot of us have had pretty awful experiences where we have felt coerced by people in more power than us to be in that situation. And you know, a lot of us still don't feel comfortable coming forward to talking about it, which is the other important and interesting thing. I just want to bring Rachel in again because we were talking before about some of the work that you've done in-house in order to try to be more inclusive and also to combat what I think is perhaps more of a systemic problem. I mean, we're all aware of sexual harassment being a major issue, but there are a lot of other issues around it which make it much more of a systemic problem. So you were talking before about what you're doing. Could you talk to us about it more?
I'd also echo, I love it that we're having this conversation. I don't love what we're talking about, but I love it that we're having the conversation. And I do think all the Weinstein and the Me Too has made everybody think about it. So ITN is a company that's been around quite a long time, has relatively grown up processes, has done quite a lot of work in this area, and we have lots of policies, but actually at the highest level we sat down because of all of this and said, well, are our policies robust enough? And we went through them, and we have an absolute zero tolerance policy on any kind of harassment, bullying, but we reissued that to all staff and freelancers and contractors and really spelt out what that means, what is okay and what isn't okay, because I think we have to be seen to do that. But also, so as we've been saying, I think it's part of something wider, and we felt we have been trying to engender a company where you can speak up about all sorts of things. There's been work on mental health, so trying to make it something that is possible to talk about within the workplace. We've been doing a lot of work on diversity and inclusion. There is so much further to go, but these are not nice to do's or let's get round to it. This is part of having a happy and healthy workforce. But certainly we reissued our guidelines and said you should be able to talk about it to a manager, to HR, but recognising that's not enough because your manager might be the problem. And certainly 20 years ago, I wouldn't have crossed my mind to go to HR, didn't think they were on our side. But we have actually launched an independent third-party run hotline that anybody can phone, whether they've witnessed something or whether they've experienced it themselves, and that is now there because we felt maybe there isn't that trust 100% in companies to do something about it. But I do think, as we're saying, it's part of this wider conversation, and there's a lot more coming out around women at the moment. Everyone's having to publish their gender pay discrepancies. There's a lot of discussion around equal pay, which I think has forced companies to think about women and everybody within their organisations and what it is like to work and have a career in these companies. And certainly we're doing some work towards the end of the year where every single member of staff will go through training meetings about culture, about being able to speak up, about being able to be yourself within that. It won't solve things overnight. Newsrooms are busy, quite difficult places. Tempers can run high. When there's breaking news, there will be shouting that you need to get on air. So they'll never be the most gentle, quiet, sort of touchy-feely places. Touchy-feely is the wrong word in that sense, but you know what I mean. But so there will always be a sort of robust character to them. But we want to make them a place where anybody can speak and feel comfortable. And God, there's a long way to go. But I'm pleased that harassment has perhaps accelerated some of these conversations.
Thank you. I mean, I'll make a couple of points. I think those are probably the kind of sexual harassment policies that we maybe want to see more of and that we maybe want to be able to access if possible. I just want to give you a couple of statistics in a moment, and then I'd like to come on to, we were talking before about the newsrooms not being a happy place and how that breeds this kind of sense of unease, and also I want to touch on kind of talk about the freelance situation. But when we did this report, I'm just going to read out these figures. As I said before, 47.9% of respondents to our report said they'd experienced sexual harassment at their jobs. The most common locations for harassment were in the office, 42%. Of 512 acts where perpetrator was classified, the categories of co-worker, boss and supervisor made up more than half. Interviewees made up only 16%. And less than 1/5 of respondents, again as I mentioned before, said they reported incidents of sexual harassment. So in light of that, I'd like to get your thoughts on why people aren't coming forward to report sexual harassment, but also talking what we mentioned before when we were talking downstairs about why newsrooms aren't a happy place, and therefore why that breeds this sense of unease.
So I was thinking about sort of journalism as a specific industry. As we know, since October, sexual harassment in all kinds of industries has been talked about, and there's lots of common things that go on between industries. There's lots of common issues about men and women that we talk about. But if we just think about journalism in isolation, my experience, I've mainly worked in sort of digital and a bit of print, so I'm very much written journalism. If you really think about what a newsroom is, in many cases, it's not exactly a team in the traditional sense. I worked a lot of places with loads of reporters. They almost act as lone wolves to quite a big extent. I can see Mark, having worked in office with Mark, you see that. I mean, reporters are incentivized to compete. If you've got loads of reporters, they're working on their own stories, they're finding their own stories, they're talking to their boss, they probably have friends in the office, but they're not exactly a team in that traditional way like in another industry. And I think that kind of thing, and the fact that our industry is very reliant on freelancers, which, as we all sort of know, companies can treat freelancers very badly or see them as a sort of body who comes in for a day and then leaves. They're not incorporated into any kind of positive workplace culture. And my feeling about this, if we think about harassment or sort of gender imbalance within the office space, is that it all comes down to training and kind of leading from the top, which can sound kind of naff and silly, but it's not sort of sitting people in sexual harassment training for an hour and then ticking a box. It's about companies really putting emphasis on how employees treat each other. I've been at places with some great training. I've worked at HuffPost and Buzzfeed. Both are really good at kind of, here's your training for the next month. What do you want to sign up to? Do you want to be a great manager? Do you want to learn about time management? This is great. And they are really, really great. And I think that's important. But even them, who are the best I've seen at training, don't do much training about how to actually treat your fellow employees and how to, what if you're unhappy, what if you're uncomfortable with your manager, what do? You don't really get that training. And I'm a big believer in good training because I have seen it and I do think it works, and it has to be compulsory, I think, because people sniff at training, they've got an important story, they're not going to go. But I think especially in terms of including men in the conversation, which is something we want to talk about today, it has to come from the top, and it has to be something that the whole company is seen to care about and participate in. So I really think that more attention from companies and from employees on how to actually act as a team and how to incorporate people, especially freelancers, especially young people. I've heard about a big newspaper, which I won't name, where I hear that if you go there, it's a great newspaper, you have to work there for 3 or 5 years before you'll be included. You'll be kind of looked at suspiciously, you won't be in the clique. And that's a classic newspaper environment. They're not, it's not like it's a wonderful place to work, loads of places. I'm not saying everyone's unhappy, but compared to somewhere like, I don't know, companies that people rave about, Facebook, maybe, I have no idea, I can't really think of ones now, but it's not about workplace culture. We've got a bit better, but we're nowhere near that with journalism. It's all about the story. We're really driven people about our work, but I don't think we're that bothered about our colleagues, and I don't think companies seem to be bothered enough. So I think that would shift sexual harassment and a lot of wider issues a lot, I think.
Can you just bring Mark in? You said before that that's kind of what you'd like. You'd like some advice and some tips and some training in terms of how you ought to behave and how you should.
Yeah, I always think that, I've got a very strong lesbian mother who tells me how to behave. So I've always thought I'm okay, but I think that, obviously, the education of young men starts in the home and then with their teachers, and by the time they get to their workplace, they should also realise that they can't harass or annoy women in a way. And look, I want to just pose something to the panel, potentially. I worked at the ABC for 4 years before starting at Buzzfeed, so I worked in a broadcaster, and now I'm sort of more in print digital. I mean, one of the things that I always find that's interesting is that when you're in your 20s, there's actually I don't say over-representation. There's more women than men in the office in journalism. So there are more, well, in my experience, especially in broadcasting, I always found that there were younger women next to younger men at a much higher rate. Problem is, this thing happens in the late 20s, early 30s, where it goes vroom, and then you just sort of blink, and then in their 40s and 50s, a lot of the men become the editors. And of course, things are changing and that sort of thing. And I think that is also a really big problem for a lot of news organisations, is that you've got this huge group of young women in their 20s who start out as journalists, and then maybe something happens in their late 20s and early 30s. I mean, of course, a lot of it has to do with biology, but what actually occurs is that there's no pathway for women to go from, a grunt journalist, like a male grunt journalist, and just stay in that job for 20, 15, whatever years.
Can I bring Rachel in here? Because I'm keen to hear your opinion, because you are one of, there are female role models in management positions in the British media, but you are of a relatively small number.
Yeah, there aren't.
So what would your response to be in terms of pathways and?
Yeah, it's a huge issue, and it's something that we're all working on, and it's an issue that's having to be faced. Again, it's one of these, can't get round to it at some point. It's very real and important now, and that's where the reporting of gender pay gap is going to be very important. It is tough. Yes, we see that in newsrooms. There's no lack of brilliant, talented younger women, and as you say, something happens. It is babies mostly, and they get to a certain level, but at that same point, men, often because they're suddenly fathers, also feel, Christ, I've got to do something, I need to earn some more money and go like that, because perhaps my partnership, she's going to be working a bit less, and again, there's a lot needs to be done around paternity and things, but that becomes even more acute, and I'm doing lots of work on this at the moment, and I'm not telling anything you don't know, but a lot of women at that point are perhaps wanting to work flexibly, and they put a lot of store into being able to work part-time, and have become very grateful for being able to work part-time, and think, actually, having my set hours is much more important to me at this stage than furthering my career. So they get sort of forgotten at that point, and at the same time, I say the men are ploughing on with their careers, and suddenly that gulf is huge. Now, I hope we're trying to change that. There's lots we're doing in-house, and there's lots of stuff we're going to be doing over the next year. There's lots of stuff that the BBC's doing, there's lots of stuff Sky's doing. It is difficult in society, but I think it's a mixture. It's allowing some of these bigger jobs to be part-time. I'm actually full-time, I've always been full-time, but it's also supporting people being full-time, so that full-time doesn't have to mean 60 hours a week or in the office the whole time, and it's not putting women off doing those jobs, but it is having mentors, it's having role models, but I think it's a will. I think companies have to want to change.